You're listening to Insights with Philip Wilson, where the discussion focuses on how to maximize Social Security benefits. Considering there are 567 ways to file and 3,000 rules for filing, it's no wonder that 90% of those who file for Social Security do not receive their maximum benefits. Listen in as Philip Wilson, who is certified in Social Security claiming strategies, outlines what you need to know to get the most from your Social Security benefits.
Welcome to the show. Continuing with the topics of retirement, we've been talking about some pretty important topics such as Social Security, filing for Social Security. I mentioned that 90% of people that file for Social Security do not receive their maximum benefits. We've been talking about that, the importance of that. This is the first generation in history that will spend more years in retirement than they did working. And Social Security being the largest source of income and the only source of lifetime income, filing for that is pretty much the most important financial decision that you're going to make. If you miss those podcasts, you can go to our website and catch those. We have them up there. Our web address is ssmistakes.com, ssmistakes.com. We also talked about college, and in particular reducing the expense of college being the largest expense for our children, and probably outside of a home, the largest expense that most of us will ever make. A lot of resources out there, a lot of different things that you can do to reduce that college. This time of the year, I hear from a lot of parents that are out there shopping for colleges, trying to figure out what to do for their kids. I'm actually one of those. My son's a junior in high school. So looking at all those things, we did a series on college, and you can also find those podcasts on our website. It's actually a separate website. It's reducecollegecost.org. reducecollegecost.org. We were also talking about income. Last couple of weeks, we've been talking about income for retirement, in particular, safe income. I mentioned that over the 30 years of practicing, probably the single biggest change to my practice has been what I would define as safe. What are the things that I would recommend to people to be safe ways to provide income in retirement? It's been pretty difficult. We've learned an awful lot of things in the last decade about things that are safe. And there's been an awful lot of investments out there that we all thought were safe that have turned out to not to be so safe. So we've been talking about that. We finished up that series. If you'd like to catch those, you can also get them on the website. And we'll have those up for you on the Social Security site, the ssmistakes.com, ssmistakes.com. Now today I want to continue with the theme of retirement, but in particular I want to focus on something pretty important to me, and that is the issue of divorce. Today I want to talk about financial decisions that need to be made after a divorce. And this is something that I teach on quite frequently with churches and various support groups, something very important. I like to bring that message to an awful lot of people. I mean, divorce is a pretty awful situation for marriages and for families and children, but financially there's an awful lot of mistakes that people make, and I just want to address that really over the next 2 weeks. And the title of this is Moving Forward Financially After a Divorce. Moving Forward Financially After a Divorce. Now, in teaching this, there's several different things that I could teach on. One of those things would be planning decisions to be made while filing for a divorce, the negotiation, very smart things that you need to know to work with your divorce attorneys and so forth. But what I've chosen to do is to focus on the time period after the divorce. So most of these financial topics will deal with that time period. They'll deal with the time period after someone has actually already filed for a divorce. It's been settled, it's been negotiated. And the main reason that I find that time period to be the most helpful for people. The biggest mistakes that I see people make are in that time period. And I think a lot of it has to do with the lack of support. Most people going through a divorce have a lot of friends and family around, a lot of people supporting them. They generally have a divorce attorney leading the way. But after the divorce is finalized, the divorce attorney's moved on. But there's an awful lot of follow-through associated with that. And so I want to talk about that. I want to focus primarily on planning decisions after the divorce. Some of these ideas will be important during a divorce, but mainly it's after the divorce that I want to focus on. That is the time period that I see people needing the most support, needing the most encouragement, but it's also the time period that I see people have the most letdown. I think the stress associated with the divorce and the dissolution of the marriage and the various splitting of the assets, after it's done, people are let down. Sometimes they don't follow through. So we want to talk about that a little bit. In particular, the first thing I really want to cover is the house. And there's an awful lot of decisions that people need to make coming out of divorce, such as, do they want to continue in their house? Do they need to downsize? Finding something more affordable. Usually the budget comes into play, sources of income from child support and alimony. A lot of times people go back to work to support that. There's also school systems, kids, the neighborhood, friends, all these different issues. I'm not really going to discuss those things, but mainly what I want to focus on is where I see the biggest issue with the house. Not necessarily the decision about whether or not to keep the house or stay there, but the decisions associated or the problems associated with the mortgage. In those situations with somebody coming out of a divorce, there's generally several things that have been negotiated. There might be a refinance. Typically, the woman will take the house. They will refinance that so that the ex is off of the mortgage. The debt that's currently on the home is a joint debt. So we want to remove the ex off of that, and we will change the deed. And the deed will go from a husband and wife to just the wife. And that's very typical for most divorces. So, and also, and together with the refinance, we might also see a situation that there's a sharing of equity. So one of the dissolution of the assets is that one person needs to pay off the other as far as the equity is concerned. That is generally done in a refinance. So whatever equity is in the house, the one party will deed the house to the other one. They will refinance, take out some of the equity, and provide that to them at closing. So refinancing, whether it's paying off the spouse or also paying off debt. Awful lot of times we are sharing debts or splitting debts, and that typically needs to happen in a refinance. There might be an equity line involved, something along those lines, or sometimes the house is put up on the market to be sold and the proceeds to be shared, and then the person plans on moving on and finding another home. But in all those situations, it's going to involve a mortgage. And most of you are probably aware in 2008 that we had an awful lot of changes in the mortgage world. The mortgage world just about sunk the worldwide economy, and there was an awful lot of tightening of those guidelines. So the biggest issue that I see in this type of situation is not so much about what to do with the house, whether or not you can afford it, school systems, kids, these different issues. I mean, those are important issues, but the biggest stress that I see is the assumption that you can obtain a mortgage. Most people coming out of this situation haven't really thought about that. They just kind of assumed that based on their current income sources, such as an alimony and child support, that they can get a mortgage. And you will find that that's not the case a lot of times. And the biggest problem that I see coming out of this is most of the time through the divorce, people have decided upon a time frame to sell the home, a time frame to refinance, a time frame to pay off debts. And they might have 6 months to take care of those things. But they're not going to qualify for a mortgage in 6 months. And this will be pretty obvious when we go through these different guidelines, because most of them have to do with time. And just because you need to refinance a house doesn't mean you're going to be able to. In fact, most people that I see coming out of divorce just flat out are not going to be able to qualify for a mortgage, and they're going to have to wait. And if they've agreed to those things in a divorce situation, they're going to be in breach of that. If they've agreed to refinance the house or sell the home or do something along those lines that requires a mortgage, and they don't have it done in that time period, it's going to be a breach. And that's the biggest area that I see the problems in. And that's really where the stress happens, because most people coming out of divorce just really have no idea. The divorce attorney, while helpful in a lot of different areas, they certainly don't know about this one. So today and over the next week, I want to really just talk about mortgage approvals and how the rules have changed since 2008, how they're different for those going into this type of situation, how they've been tweaked for someone in this situation. Most people are aware that mortgages are much more difficult to obtain these days. And there's been an awful lot of changes in mortgages, but in particular, they've tried to identify areas that created problems in 2008, problems in foreclosure. Where did those come from? And a largest place that they came from were in these refinance type situations where there was a distress situation, or we were paying off debt, where we were taking out equity to maybe pay off a spouse, pay off another person, or pay off other debts. And this was identified as one of those areas that created some issues in the industry. So an awful lot of rules have been put in for that. The bottom line for most people that I run into is that they have made agreements that they cannot fulfill. They've agreed to downsize, sell the home. They've agreed to refinance, take the X off the mortgage. They've agreed to refinance, pay off the equity, their share of equity. They maybe want to refinance, pay off some debt, and they're just not going to be able to do it. And my goal here is I don't want you to be an expert on mortgages, but I certainly want you to understand where some of these things, where some of these issues are. And one of the things that you'll notice is that just about everything has to do with time. How long we have received this or received that before we can qualify, or before we can use that as a source of income. And that's the part that I need you to understand, because you just may find that you're going to have to wait, and there's really nothing you can do about it. And for those that have agreed to do these things in a time frame, you're going to need to go back to your divorce attorney and renegotiate the time frames for completion. So again, I don't want you to become an expert in mortgage approvals, but when we come back from the break, I want to just go over the particulars and what things have changed since 2008. Welcome back. We've been talking about planning decisions that need to be made after divorce. And the biggest area of stress that I see is with the house. A lot of issues that people face after divorce, affordability of their house, the budget. Can they continue to stay there? Do they need to find something less expensive? The school system, the kids, do we want to uproot the kids, take them away from their buddies in the neighborhood? A lot of different issues involved with the house. But the biggest issue that I see, and the biggest stress that's caused for someone coming out of a divorce, is the mortgage. Just about every situation that I see when people go through a divorce, there is a mortgage that's necessary to do something. They might need to refinance, pay off the X. They might need to refinance, pay equity to them. They might need to consolidate debt. They might need to sell their home, buy a new home, but there's a mortgage involved in all those situations. And the biggest problem that I see people make is that they make the assumption that obtaining a mortgage is not a problem. And most of you are aware that since 2008, the mortgage world has really changed. I've been helping people with mortgages for 30 years, and I would say in the last 10 years, more has changed in that time period than my entire career times 10. Obtaining a loan these days is just not easy. The biggest problem that I see people run into in a divorce situation, and the biggest amount of stress, is because they have agreed to some sort of time frame for either selling the home or obtaining a mortgage or something along those lines, and they're just not able to fulfill that. They're actually in breach of their own agreement, because time is generally what needs to happen in a mortgage situation, and that would be more obvious as we go through this. But a lot of different sources of income and different situations that are unique to a divorce situation, you have to have time. You have to have, for example, in order for child support to be a source of income, you have to be receiving it for a certain amount of months. And most of the time, people coming out of a divorce have set the time frame for the refinance or obtaining that mortgage, and they don't realize that they're going to have to wait. And so that's what we want to talk about. So let me just provide you Mortgages 101. And I don't want you to become an expert on this, but I just need you to understand the various requirements associated with a divorce coming out of 2008. They're going to present some problems for you. So the first thing I want to get across to you are basically what the two elements are that lenders need to look at, or what lenders look at when obtaining a mortgage. And most people are familiar with this. There's basically two issues. There's an income issue and there's a credit issue. The income issue would be, what is your income? Is it stable? Is it likely to continue? These are questions that a lender wants to know. Just because you receive income doesn't mean it's going to be counted. And just because you have income doesn't necessarily mean it's likely to continue. That's something that a lender really wants to know. So stable income is a very, very important concept. Now, the biggest change from 2008 is what is considered stable and what is not considered stable. And those are the things that really create the problems for someone coming out of a divorce. The two issues that I generally see, and the biggest issue that I see, is someone who reenters the workforce. In that situation, someone might be staying home with children, and they decide, based on the alimony and the child support, that it's just not going to be enough. They go back to work maybe on a full-time or a part-time basis to try to help pay the bills. And in fact, most women that I meet with in this type of situation, that generally is the case. The problem is, with a lender, that is not considered stable income. If someone reenters the workforce on a part-time basis, that isn't necessarily considered stable income. In fact, most of the time, it's not considered stable income. In order for it to be stable, what a lender generally wants to see, particularly with respect to part-time income, is that there's a history involved. They generally want to see about 24 months. So if you are trying to have that income counted and you don't have 24 months of history associated with it, you're not going to be counted. Just because you went back to work, you worked for 2 or 3 months, you've gotten a few paychecks, it's not going to be used. And that's a big surprise for a lot of people. That's a big surprise that I run into, but that is not considered a stable income source. So reentering on a part-time basis, you have to have 24 months. This is where the time frame comes in, because again, most of the time, what I see people are agreeing to have these things taken care of in maybe 6 months. That tends to be the normal time frame. Well, in order to qualify, if you need that part-time income, you're going to have to wait a whole lot longer than that. That generally is the biggest problem that I see. Now, just because somebody goes back to work, even on a full-time basis, if it's a new line of work and there's some kind of concern that the mortgage company has as far as whether or not that's going to be consistent, it's not going to be counted either. In fact, the only time I really see those types of situations as being counted is when you have a professional person like a lawyer or a doctor or an accountant, someone that has a degree, someone that has a background, and they decide to stay home to raise children and they reenter the workforce. And I do see those situations as being counted. Most of the time when we're trying to help someone obtain a mortgage in that situation, we use their resume. We show their marketability. I mean, most lenders will consider that income stable if someone has a prior history of working in that industry. But if it's a new industry, even on a full-time basis, it's a difficult thing to understand. It's a difficult thing for the mortgage companies to use. Other problems exist with alimony or child support. Generally, you have to have about 6 months of receipt of those things before they will be counted is a stable monthly income. So even though the divorce decree says that you will receive alimony or child support, you cannot count that as a source of income unless you've been receiving it for a certain amount of months, and that is generally about 6 months. And what lenders are going to see there is to make sure that whoever is responsible for those payments are actually doing it. They know there's a lot of deadbeat husbands out there that just because the agreement says that, they're not going to do it. And they're going to want to see deposits, they're going to want to see checks, they're going to want to see that money going into your account every month on a regular basis. And they're going to want to see something that helps them feel like that's going to be a stable source of income. So stable income is number one. Alimony and child support aren't necessarily counted as being stable. Reentering the workforce isn't necessarily counted as being stable. You generally have to show a prior earnings history. Someone is capable of doing something, it's not something new. Very little risk to the lender that income will continue. Now, in the second, I mentioned two things. One is stable income, one is credit. Most people are aware that your credit history matters, obviously, when you're getting a mortgage loan. Now, the problem, I see several problems. One, typically, when someone goes through a divorce, there's typically some late payments. That's not uncommon. Most people going through those situations, a bill has been missed here or there. One of the dangers in the last 2 decades to lending is that it is very automated. In the past, there was a human component to a mortgage. There was someone making the decision about whether or not someone could make that payment. In recent decades, it became more automated, it was more based on credit scores and less of a human involvement. And there were some positives associated with that. One of the negatives is that if you have a low credit score or a blemished credit history, there's very little explanations that are going to matter with a mortgage loan. In fact, no one really cares in those situations. There's less of a human there. Writing in the old days, we used to be able to write an explanation whenever someone had missed a payment on something, and you might have someone that's never missed a mortgage payment or never missed an obligation their entire life. Then they went through a brief period of time for a few months where some of the bills were missed. Doesn't really matter anymore. Less humans involved, more credit score oriented, and this is one of the negatives, because we just don't have the ability to explain these things like we used to in the old days. So credit history is a big issue, and we're going to talk a little bit probably next week about credit scores and how they're determined. But the other issue that I run into are joint debts. And a typical scenario is where a husband and wife have purchased a car or some other debt, some other asset, and have a joint debt. And as part of the divorce, those debts are separated, and one party will take that debt over the other and is responsible for those payments. However, since the debt was a joint debt, it reports to both credit reports. And just because the divorce decree says that you are not responsible for that doesn't mean a lender is going to ignore it. And so the biggest problem that we run into there is where someone is trying to qualify and they cannot qualify because of one of these joint debts. So even though they're not making the payment, someone else is making the payment, it still is counted against them. And the only way that you can prove to a lender that you are not responsible for this is with history. You've got to provide 12 months of payments. You've got to show 12 months that the other party is making that payment for it to be excluded for qualification purposes. And there's some other things that we'll talk about next week related to this to protect your credit history and protect your future borrowing and so forth. But we're just going to need to wrap up the time today, and I'll look forward to talking to you next week.
You've been listening to Insights with Philip Wilson, an Alabama registered investment advisor. Learn more by visiting his website at ssmistakes.com or by calling 205-868-9297.